Elena Tartaglia is a co-founder of National Moth Week and a professor of biology at Bergen Community College in New Jersey. Elena earned her Ph.D. from Rutgers University and has worked in science outreach and environmental education since 2005. She is an expert on the moths of the family Sphingidae, having studied various aspects of their ecology and behavior. Her current focus in her research is on long-term ecological change and plant invasions in urban ecosystems. So at this point, I will turn things over to Elena to get us started.
Hi, thank you for having me. And thank you to everyone who's here tonight. I really appreciate you attending. So I'm going to talk to you guys tonight about moth ecology and conservation, and also about our citizen science project, National Moth Week, which is set to begin in just a few days this year. And so maybe by the end of the presentation, you'll want to participate yourself. So if we start with National Moth Week. National Moth Week is a global community science project that started with kind of humble beginnings in East Brunswick, New Jersey. And so back in 2009 and 2010 and 2011, a group of us would host these sort of local community events for the people of East Brunswick to come and hang out with us and come see what kind of nocturnal insects would come to our light and our black light and sheet setup. And we thought no one would really be interested in that kind of thing, but it turns out lots and lots of people wanted to come and see the moths that we would get at our sheets in East Brunswick. And so one night after we were kind of breaking down, we were sort of cleaning up after everyone had left and breaking down our equipment, we started thinking about, wouldn't it be fun if we got everyone in New Jersey to participate in a moth night on the same night, like just get a whole statewide event going. And then as we kept cleaning up and it was sort of getting later and later into the evening, maybe midnight or 1 a.m., we were getting a little sillier and we were thinking, wouldn't it be fun to get everyone in the United States to participate? And then we thought, well, why stop there? Let's get everyone in the whole world. And we did. So we made a website and we just sort of put this out there online. We got a Facebook at that time. And since then, National Moth Week has grown from, a few people hosting some events to a global phenomenon. And so in 2022, we had over 2,000 events in 68 countries. So National Moth Week has become really big and people all over the world participate in the data collection that we're doing. And Moth Week always occurs in the last full week of July. So this 2023 Moth Week is coming up in just a few days. It'll be July 22nd through 30th. And so it's set to begin. So today's the 20th. So maybe you'll want to participate next week. So whenever I give a talk about moths, I do like to first acknowledge that moths have gotten kind of a bad reputation. And the media is partially to blame for that. So I'm going to give a few examples. So this is my first example, the movie, The Silence of the Lambs. And so this is getting to be a little bit of an older movie now. It's a horror movie. And so people who are really into horror will know this movie. And it's said to be one of the scariest movies of all time. And I have not seen it because I'm too afraid. But I read the Wikipedia entry, the synopsis. And so in this movie, a serial killer takes moth pupae and puts them in the mouth of his victims. And then when the victims are found, a moth hatches out of the mouth. And so that's what's happening on this movie poster. So on the movie poster, we can see this moth. This is a real moth. It really looks like this. It's called the Death's Head Hawk Moth. And it features this little skull-like pattern on its thorax. And there is actually a moth that really looks like that. So that's one of the scariest movies of all time, prominently featuring a moth. Then we have this guy. This is the Mothman. The Mothman is a cryptozoological creature who is said to terrorize young couples in West Virginia. And so people are really scared of him, except that it does seem like the tides are turning on the Mothman, because in a town in West Virginia, there's an entire museum dedicated to his honor. And there is also an annual festival held for the Mothman. And if you're interested in attending, this year is apparently on September 16th and 17th. In West Virginia. And then, of course, no discussion of moths in the media is complete without a mention of Mothra, the original moth movie star in the Mothra versus Godzilla movies, right? So moths have this kind of a bad reputation from the media. And also, when I tell people that I have studied moths and I give programs on moths, they always say, oh gosh, no, I hate moths. Moths eat my sweaters. You know, that's really not fair, right? It's not fair to say, because there are thousands of species of moths in the world. And of those thousands of species, only a few, like 2 of them, are species that eat sweaters. And so it's really not fair to blame this entire taxon for the problems caused by a few, right? And of course, moths play really fundamental roles in ecosystems. So moths are important to humans in a variety of ways. So moths contribute to ecosystem function. And of course, we know that without a functional ecosystem, human life can't exist either. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of moth roles in ecosystems. And I'll start with decomposition. And decomposition is the process by which dead plants and animals break down. So if there were no decomposition, like, not to be too gross, but like, if there were no decomposition, everything that ever died would still be here, and that would be unpleasant, right? So to go into a little more scientific detail there, when a plant grows in soil, it takes nutrients from the soil to grow its body, right? So it takes nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil to grow its roots and its leaves, etc. And it grows its body by soil nutrients. So when the plant dies, the only way for those nutrients to go back into the soil is via the process of decomposition. And moths are one of many organisms, of course, along with bacteria and fungi, that aid in decomposition. And so getting nutrients from the bodies of plants and the bodies of animals that took those nutrients out of the soil back into the soil and maintaining fertile soils. And we need fertile soils in order to grow our crops, right? So we need soil fertility, and moths are part of the suite of organisms that helps maintain that. Of course, moths are food, right? Moths play roles in food webs. They're food for bats, they're food for birds, they're food for lizards, even bears and foxes, raccoons, possums, any omnivorous organism or insectivore is going to eat moths. So they're really essential in food webs. And in particular, scientists find that caterpillars, the larvae of moths and butterflies, are absolutely essential for breeding bird nesting success. So caterpillars are the main food source for baby birds. And if you think about it, a caterpillar is a perfect baby food, right? It's like a soft little sack of protein. Of course, the birds want to feed their babies soft food. And I love these photos because you can see little birds feeding their babies little caterpillars, and this big raptor feeding its big baby, a big hornworm caterpillar. So caterpillars, the larvae of moths and butterflies, are absolutely essential to maintaining bird populations. And a lot of this, many scientists do this work, but a lot of this comes from the work of Bergen and Ptolemy. And then, of course, moths play a role in pollination, just like many other insects. And so ensuring reproductive success carrying pollen from plant to plant, moths are major pollinators. So without moths, we would have fewer plants, we'd have no birds, maybe no birds at all, and we'd have less decomposition and all of that. Like, a world without those things is not really a world that I'm especially interested in living in. So we really need these ecosystem functions. And if you're a person who's like, okay, but how do we benefit financially from these things? Actually, we do. So I'm going to give you just 2 examples of moths playing a direct role in human economies, and I'm going to do an ancient one and a modern one. So I'll start with the ancient one, and that is the process of sericulture. And so sericulture is the production of silk. And so believe it or not, silk is produced by an insect. So maybe you know this, but silk is produced by caterpillars of several species, but the main one is this silk moth called Bombyx mori. And we call this mulberry silk because its main diet is mulberry leaves. So silk is actually made of mulberry trees in a roundabout way. So what happens is when the caterpillar So here's the caterpillar. When the caterpillar is ready to go into its next life stage, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a second, when the caterpillar is ready to begin its next life stage, it's going to go into its pupa form. And when it does that, it spins a cocoon made of a single long strand of silk. And that strand of silk can be up to 1,000 feet long, right? So it's a single strand of silk. And what is that silk? It's actually the saliva of the caterpillar. So in order to make the cloth of silk, those cocoons have to be really carefully unwound so as not to break that thread. And then they are sort of spun and plied into thread. So that's what's happening in this image here in the lower left. We can see a worker is taking several of these cocoons and carefully unrolling the strand of silk and making thread. And then the thread is woven and dyed into silk fabric, into these beautiful patterns and colors that we see in silks. And so if you're wondering why, if you're like, well, why is silk so expensive when you just told me it's bug spit? Right? So it can take up to 3,000 of those cocoons, or about the size of the end of your finger. It can take up to 3,000 of them to make a single yard of silk. So it takes many, many, many cocoons to make silk. And it's a really labor-intensive process, both for the moths and for the humans. And humans have been making silk. The process of sericulture dates back thousands and thousands of years. So we've been using these insects for a really, really long time as part of our economic systems. And then the modern example is, this is a moth called the fall armyworm, and cells from the fall armyworm were used in producing one of our vaccines against COVID-19 by a company called Novavax. So this is, it's not an mRNA vaccine, it's a different mechanism, but you know, the more ways to fight a pandemic, the better, right? And personally, I'm thrilled to receive a COVID vaccine that came from a moth, right? So moths are still, to this day, this ancient process of sericulture is still continuing, and they're still helping us out, contributing to our economy and our health by their cells being used to produce COVID vaccines, which I think is incredible. So let's talk a little bit about the biology and life history of moths and butterflies next. So these insects are in this order called Lepidoptera. And Lepidoptera, optera means wing and lepido means scaly. So they have scaly wings. So if you've ever seen a butterfly or moth wing up close, you can tell, so this is a microscope photo, but you can see these tiny overlapping scales made of protein. And those scales give the wings the unique colors and patterns that we see on a lot of butterflies and moths. So the question is that I get, well, why do they have those colors and patterns? And there's a variety of functions for the wing scales. Giving the colors and patterns is the first one. And those colors and patterns do a lot of function in predation defense in a variety of ways. So I'll talk about a couple of predation defenses that are conferred by the colors and patterns given by the wing scales. So the first one is aposematic coloration. So aposematic coloration, you can see in a lot of different organisms, moths included, and that's just the term for that bright warning coloration that we see here. So we can see some tiger moths here, and they're red and orange and yellow and black. And that's to warn predators that the organism is, maybe it tastes bad or it's poisonous, it's toxic, right? And so we can see aposematic coloration on many different animals, and moths are just one of those animals. So the wing scales giving the bright color signals to predators, don't eat this, it tastes bad. The wing patterns can also be used in mimicry. So in the middle set of images here, we see a moth called an Io moth. So here's a moth in the top line here, is just kind of chilling on a tree trunk. But if a predator comes and tries to eat it, or if you're a person that wants to see, you can tap it and it will flash these eye spots to look like a predator, right? And so that will be startling to maybe the bird or whatever is trying to eat that moth. So they can use these patterns conferred by the wing scales to do mimicry, to mimic predators and avoid being eaten themselves. And then still others use their wing scales for the predation defense of camouflage. So here's a beautiful moth subtly beautiful moth, really blending in so well with the trunk of the tree that it's on. And camouflage is, of course, a predation defense. If your predator can't see you, it can't eat you. And if you've ever touched a butterfly or a moth, you know that those wing scales rub off really easily. And that's actually not an accident. That's actually part of the predation defense. So in this GIF, you can see it's a little tough to see, but this is an owl. And it's got a moth in its talon, and that moth is flapping for its life. And you can see what looks like snow here is actually the wing scales of the moth flying off, and they're an irritant to mucous membranes. So the scales are sort of flying into the mouth and the eyes of the owl that will irritate it in hopes that that owl is going to let it go. And there's a persistent myth that a lepidopteran that loses its wing scales can no longer fly. And that's actually not true. They can fly. If you take all the scales off, they can still fly. Even this butterfly with missing half its wings and many wing scales, this butterfly could still fly. That's not to say that you should ever take the scales off on purpose, of course, but the wing scales are not part of the flight process, which is something a lot of people believe. And now you know the truth. So Lepidoptera undergo the process of metamorphosis. And for this particular group of insects, we call this complete metamorphosis. So for complete metamorphosis, there's 4 distinct life stages. So we'll briefly talk about each one. So starts its life as an egg, and the eggs hatch into larvae. And the larvae of Lepidoptera are called caterpillars. And the function of a caterpillar is to eat as much as possible. So you probably recognize this guy. This is the very hungry caterpillar. And I like to say that's a work of nonfiction. Caterpillars are very hungry all the time. And their function is to eat as much as possible and get nutrition and energy and body fat to sustain it through the next portions of its life. So when it's reached an appropriate size and nutritional state, the next phase is the pupa. And some butterflies and moths spin that silk cocoon, some don't, some pupate underground, some stay in leaves. So it just depending on the insect is how the pupa looks. And the pupa is that transitional stage between the larva and the adult. In Lepidoptera, the adults are sort of large-bodied with wings to fly around, and their goal is to find a mate, lay eggs, and start the life cycle over. So we have 4 distinct life stages here in our complete metamorphosis: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. And the mouthparts can be pretty different across the different life stages. So as caterpillars, the mouthparts are called mandibles, and they're for biting. So they're like a little movable jaw. So we could see this caterpillar chowing down on this leaf, eating and eating. And you can see that the mouth part is called a mandible. It looks like a little jaw for cutting leaves. As adults, many moths and butterflies have a mouth part called a proboscis, which we can see here on the left. This is that long straw-like mouth part used for drinking nectar. So they only consume solid food as caterpillars. As adults, most of them only drink liquid from flowers, the nectar, that sugary water that flowers produce. And in fact, some of them eat so much as caterpillars and live such a short time as adults that they have no mouth at all. So they live for such a short period of time as adults that they don't even have mouth parts. So people always ask me, so what's the difference between a moth and a butterfly? So as a scientist, I have to first say that evolutionarily speaking, moths and butterflies are not fundamentally different. So I include this diagram. This diagram is called a phylogenetic tree for the nerdiest among us. This is a diagram that shows evolutionary relationships between organisms. And this one focuses on a few families of Lepidoptera. So if we're gonna put a fine point on it here. These groups here are moths, and these groups here are moths, and then we just have this random group in the middle that are the butterflies. So there's no distinct evolutionary branch that we call moths and a distinct one that we call butterflies. They're sort of integrated here in the phylogenetic or evolutionary tree. But if we want to take a look, if if you have an insect in your hand or on a flower that you're looking at, and you're like, well, I really want to know, is it a butterfly or a moth? That's fine. So let's talk about some differences. So first, I'll say that moth species actually outnumber butterflies by about 10 to 1. And this is in terms of the number of species on Earth. And even if we just talk about some specific numbers, in the US, there's about 11,000 species of moth and about 800 to 900 species of butterfly. And then in the world, there's 160,000 species of moths and about 17 to 18,000 species of butterflies. So there are quite a few more moth species than butterfly species. And of course, new species get discovered all the time. And unfortunately, also species go extinct pretty frequently, but there are many more moth species than butterflies. So a couple of things to look at if you're looking at a bug and you're like, is this a moth or a butterfly? Okay, so a really good characteristic to tell is by the antennae. So butterflies have what we call club-tipped antennae. So the antennae ends in a little club here. Moth antennae are variable. Many of them have just what we call filiform or plain antennae. So see here, there's no club tip. Or they can have pectinate, what we call pectinate, which is these big feathery antennae, particularly in males, and that's for sensing females. So take a look at the antennae. If they've got the little club tips, you're looking at a butterfly. And then the active time. So all butterflies are diurnal. Diurnal is the opposite of nocturnal. Diurnal means they are awake and active in the daytime. Some moths are diurnal. So these are our clear wing moths, some of my favorites. That's some of the group I worked on for my dissertation, these clear wing diurnal moths, really beautiful. But most moths are nocturnal, whether they're sort of crepuscular, coming out at twilight, or coming out late in the night. So if it's active during the day, likely a butterfly. Look closer, maybe it's a moth. And if it's active at night, it's a moth. And then the way that they hold their wings while resting is indicative of whether we're looking at a butterfly or a moth. So butterflies tend to, when they're roosting or resting, holding on to something, they tend to have their wings sort of folded upright, sticking straight up. Sometimes they have them flat out. Moths are a little variable. Most times in many species of moths, they've got the forewing, so that's the top wing, folded over the hind wing or the bottom wing, so they look like this. Sometimes they're in a little triangular tent shape. Sometimes they're rolled up like a little tube. That's very cute. And then sometimes they are resting with their wings flat. So butterflies most often have their wings folded upright. And then if I leave this out, if I don't mention this, someone's gonna stop me and say, wait, you forgot something. I know one. Butterflies are pretty and moths are ugly. But I am going to set you straight on that. That's simply not true. So here we have two species. We have this spectacular and beautiful Madagascan Uranian moth, and this is some brown butterfly over here, right? And not to say that she's also not lovely in her own way, but there are many moths with absolutely fabulous colors and patterns. And you're saying, well, clearly in the Northeast, right, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, obviously they're all ugly brown ones, right? No, and that's also not true, because here in the Northeast, we have absolutely spectacularly beautiful moths. If you know where to look for them, you can easily find them and see our absolutely gorgeous diversity of moths that we have here in the Northeast. So next I want to talk about, so we've done our life history and our biology and how do we tell the difference between a butterfly and a moth. And next I'm going to talk a little bit about moth conservation. And globally, 40% of insect pollinators, mostly moths and butterflies, are at risk of extinction. And this is from a report that came out in 2016. And so that's even a few years old now. And I don't know if there has been an update, but safe to say that probably more insects are at risk of declines and extinction now. So we're going to talk about some major threats to moths that also extend to many other types of insects. So the number one threat to biodiversity worldwide, whether we're talking about an elephant or a panda or a moth, is habitat loss. And of course, there's different scales to that. So habitat loss is the number one driver of biodiversity loss globally. In particular, for insects, our national addiction to maintaining perfect monoculture lawns is driving extinction of many types of insects. So instead of, being good stewards of our land and creating habitat and fitting our homes into the sort of, well, here up where we are, we're in the Northeast deciduous forest habitats, instead of fitting our homes into that, we feel the need to erase any bit of biodiversity except grass, right? And to me, this picture on the right, like, that's what I want. Like, people are like, is that your house? I'm like, I wish, right? I wish my property looked like this. I'm trying, right? I'm planting native plants. But we really need to shift our thinking away from maintaining grass for the reason of what? To having native habitat. And, I don't mean to say you should have zero grass or you can't, because I have some grass in my lawn too. I like to sit outside, and have friends over and whatever. But we do need to start thinking about taking at least part of our land. And if you're fortunate enough to have a yard, and setting some aside as native habitat. Okay. And really, in particular, this machine, I always say if I can uninvent one machine in the world, it would be the leaf blower. Leaf blowers are particularly dangerous for insect populations. So in the fall, when moths and butterflies and many other insects are getting ready to spend the winter, many of them spend the winter at the base of trees in leaf litter. And what do we do with our leaf litter, right? We blow it away and we put it in plastic bags and we send it to a landfill, which is the worst thing we could be doing with it, right? Really, there's no harm in leaving it. But instead, we feel the need to remove every bit of leaf from any grass, right? And again, I'm not saying don't remove any leaves. Of course, we need places to walk, sidewalks and paths and stuff, and that's fine. But we do need to leave some leaf litter if we want insect populations to continue. And in particular, those wild silk moths that everybody loves, the Luna moths and the Cecropia moths, spend the winter as cocoons wrapped in leaves, in leaf litter at the base of trees. And that makes really good insulation, keeps the insects alive over the winter. But when we take our leaves and we remove every single leaf, and we either send it to a landfill, or some people are like, well, I mulch my leaves. Well, if you put an insect through a mulcher, it also dies, right? So I encourage everyone that we really need to shift our thinking. Again, we need to shift our thinking away from remove every single leaf, have nothing but grass, to a more sustainable future. And some countries are actually moving towards banning leaf blowers altogether. And it's not just the insect populations. These things are bad for people too, between noise pollution and air pollution as well. And so I'm advocating really for people to shift their thinking from we need to remove all of our leaves and throw them away, to just leave them where they are and help out a little bit with the insect populations. Like, be a steward of your land and advocate for local biodiversity. So pollution, so that's habitat loss. Again, habitat loss, if you're talking about declines in biodiversity, habitat loss is the number one driver. Pollution in the form of pesticides and herbicides and fertilizer in service of maintaining perfect lawns. Of course, pesticides affect insect populations, right? In the pursuit of maintaining these lawns, instead of letting decomposition happen and building up our soil that way, we remove the leaves, then we got to apply fertilizer for the nutrients that we took out, right? So that leads to insect declines as well. So, I like to talk, I'm a pretty anti-lawn person. And so I always like to show this meme, right? That lawns, perfect monoculture grass lawns are really need to become a thing of the past in favor of a more sustainable way of treating our land. So this on the right here, this is my backyard. And this was last summer. And I will tell you, I do not remove a single leaf from my giant red maple tree. So this is a big red maple. As you can imagine, in the fall, maybe hundreds of thousands, millions of leaves fall off of this tree, and I leave them be, right? I do not leaf blow. I'm too lazy to even rake. And despite my best efforts here, my grass is absolutely fine back here. Now, is it a perfect lawn with only blades of grass? No, there's some little weeds in here. Who cares? It's perfectly usable. And so I like to tell people, I'm giving you permission to enjoy your fall. Enjoy the beautiful season of autumn. Go out, look at leaves in forests, look at the beautiful leaves on the trees, go apple picking. You don't have to spend every moment raking and leaf blowing. You could just enjoy your weekends. So fossil fuel emissions, we know that those are bad for people. They're also bad for insects. They're bad for many animals. So this is an artist rendering. This is not actually like an exhaust pipe blowing in a moth's face, thankfully. But just to make the point that these fossil fuel emissions, these volatile chemicals, can interfere with the way that insects, in particular moths, can do two things: both forage for food, because they are relying on flower scent, and find mates because they're also relying on chemical signals from females to find mates. And believe it or not, fossil fuel emissions can hinder those processes. Another major driver of nocturnal biodiversity declines is light pollution. And light we think of as totally innocuous. We think of light as completely harmless, right? We think of light as beneficial even. And so people often are amazed to find that light is a form of pollution. So here's a map of the US, and here we are in the Northeast. I'm from New Jersey. I can see New York City, the city that never sleeps, right from my window. I'm in North Jersey. And you can see here, we're like the brightest part of the country at night. And that's actually not good. Darkness is habitat, okay? And so we have two different sort of ways that light pollution is harmful. So we have this sort of ambient light at night, right? So this is a photo. It's not my photo, but it's a photo taken at night, and we see the sky is not dark here at all. And then we also have insects attracted to lights, and we'll talk more about that in a second, right? So we have these like point source pollution for light, and we just have this general ambient brightness at night where it just seems to never really get dark. So light is a problem for moths and other nocturnal insects for a variety of reasons. And so I know you guys are curious, why are moths and other insects attracted to lights? So let's talk about that for a second. And so the inconvenient truth is really that we can't ask them. I've tried as a person who studies moths. I mean, like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this, right? But our best theory is that moths and other nocturnal organisms, like we know this for sea turtles as well, that hatch at night, they navigate by the brightest light in the sky. And so in a pre-human world, when these organisms evolved, right, the brightest light in the night sky was the moon. And they could easily navigate by the light of the moon and like the direction of the moon of where to fly. But when we put something in the sky that is not only brighter than the moon, but also a lot closer than the moon, insects fly to this light confused. And then when they get here, they fly around aimlessly because this is not a navigational aid the way the moon is. And so these lights can cause a couple of problems. The insects can collide with them, and oftentimes these things get very hot. They can collide and incinerate. If they don't crash into the light, they'll just fly around aimlessly all night, and that can lead to fatal exhaustion, right? They can use up their preciously small energy stores. They can't store that much energy in their body, they're tiny. The light at night, whether it's from a pointed source like this or just that ambient light, disrupts circadian rhythms of nocturnal organisms. It also disrupts circadian rhythms of humans too. And so these organisms are now awake. Um, they're awake at night, which they normally are, but when they get close to these lights, it's often so bright that they go into their resting state. So now they're sleeping at night instead of being awake at night, and that disrupts their circadian rhythm. It wastes their time and energy. It wastes their preciously short lives aimlessly flying around these lights. They run out of energy. They waste time that they could be foraging, they could be mating, and they're not. And it opens them up to increased predation. So birds and bats are smart. They often learn to hunt around light sources. And so imagine if you're a bat, you just fly through here with your mouth open. You don't have to do anything. Just get a mouthful of food. And it opens them up to increased predation. And all of those things, that fatal exhaustion, the disrupted rhythms leading to increased death, decreases diversity. We see broken food webs, we see bird declines, we see decreased pollination, we'll see decreased all those ecosystem functions that we need these insects for. And so we think of light as harmless, or we even sometimes think of light as beneficial at night for us, but light is really, really harmful to many nocturnal organisms, whether it's a nocturnal insect or a sea turtle or any of those things. And dark sky, so we have to find a workaround for that, because I'm also a person and I also sometimes go out at night, particularly as a moth researcher. And I need to see too, right? We do need, as humans, we do need to go places in the dark sometimes. But dark sky doesn't have to mean dark ground. And we can mitigate the damages done by our nocturnal lighting. And people think, there's always the argument, oh, well, nighttime lighting deters crime and reduces accidents. And there's actually no clear evidence of that. When we look at actual stats and data, that the brighter lights doesn't mean reduced crime or reduced accidents. And so we need to, there are ways, and we need to start implementing ways to both keep our lighting, because we do need to see at night, but also not light the entire sky. So things like shielding, pointing the lights down to the ground instead of wasting the energy just sort of broadcasting that light up into the night sky. We can shield them to direct that light to the ground. Changing the temperature of the color is going to change the organisms that may or may not be able to be attracted to it. Decreasing intensity, these lights don't have to be that bright. And also changing the timing so that they're on a better time scale of not being on just indiscriminately all night. So if you're looking for resources on reducing your nighttime lighting impact, there's a great website called darksky.org that you can check out for lighting resources. And remember that darkness, like I said, darkness is a form of habitat, and nocturnal organisms need dark skies. And so turn off your outside lights sometimes, or use motion detectors. Do something to mitigate that damage. And the best thing to do in order to maintain biodiversity is to reduce lawn and maintain diverse native plant plantings. And so you guys are in Arboretum group, so we're going to talk about plants next. And a good resource for native plants, this is jerseyyards.org, which is, I know you guys are, some of you are probably in Pennsylvania, that's where the Arboretum is located, but Jersey Yards is just sort of a Northeast native plant resource. So that's a great one. So let's talk about some specific plants, because now you're like, now I'm in. I want to attract moths, and I want to help them, and I want to help mitigate biodiversity losses. So you might recognize some of these plants from your butterfly garden. If you have a butterfly garden, you probably have some plants that are good for moths. But let's talk about a few. And I also did provide Amy with a resource that I think she's making available for you guys for resources for plants and what to plant and what to do to mitigate moth losses. So what's a moth looking for, right? So moths need some specifics in their flowers. Because they're nocturnal, they're looking for flowers that are of course open and producing nectar at night. and that have a light color, because they do a lot of foraging by scent. And speaking of lighting, I think I'm going to turn on my light here. Okay, just aim that a little that way, because we're getting a little dark. So light color is going to be most visible to them at night. So they forage both by scent, and they actually do have pretty good vision for insects. So the lighter the color, so a light, a white, a light pink, a light yellow are good ones to attract them. Strong scent, again, we're talking about insects that use a lot of fluorovolatile chemicals to detect their food sources. We're looking for lots of nectar in these flowers. Moths tend to have sort of large bodies, and it's a little colder at night, so they need more energy to sustain their flight. So lots of nectar and a long tube shape to accommodate that proboscis. So what are some specific plants? So here are some that, here are just a few of them that we know are open and producing nectar at night and have that sort of white or light color. So my all-time favorite is coral honeysuckle. And if you're going to plant one native plant, I would argue to make it coral honeysuckle. It's a beautiful plant. It's a honeysuckle, so it grows really fast. I have a couple that I planted just a few years ago that are massive on trellises. It attracts hummingbirds. Who doesn't like hummingbirds? It attracts bees, and it is also a great nectar source for moths as well. Your clethra, if you're looking for shrubs, evening primrose, phlox, and dogbane for herbaceous plants. If you have a butterfly garden, chances are you probably have some phlox already because it's a very popular plant. And also, I want to put an argument in favor of buttonbush, which many people think, oh, well, isn't that an obligate wetland plant? It's actually not. I have one in my yard, which is not a wetland, and it does great. It just finished its bloom. It had dozens and dozens of those beautiful puffball blooms. It's so fragrant and beautiful. So these are definitely good. These are just a few moth plants for nectar. These are more that, again, these are some really popular ones in our butterfly gardens. You probably, if you have a butterfly garden, you probably have bee balm. Guarantee you got milkweed, right? Everybody wants monarchs. Moths can also nectar on that. Coneflower, a spectacular one. Nobody doesn't like coneflower, right? And then in terms of Lepidoptera, you have to also think about host plants, which a host plant is the caterpillar food. So they need to drink nectar as adults, but many of them need some very specific plants for their larval stages. And so you have to also provide those. And some of them do double duty, right? The button bushes, the honeysuckles, those are also larval host plants. Stuff like rhododendrons and azaleas are host plants. And then why not grow some food for yourself with blueberries and rubus? Rubus are raspberries and blackberries, which are also great Lepidoptera hosts. And then I know it's kind of a tough sell, but Virginia creeper and grapevines are also larval host plants. For, in particular, the ones I studied for my dissertation, many of them use the Virginia creeper and grapevines. And I think, personally, I know people think of Virginia creeper as a weedy plant, but look how beautiful it looks in the fall. Leave it. And then people are like, oh, well, wait, but I want to attract the wild silk moths. What flowers can I plant to have them come in and nectar? Well, unfortunately, these are the group that doesn't feed as adults. So these guys live a few days to maybe a few weeks in their adult stage, which is what makes seeing them so special, right? So there's nothing you can plant for them to drink nectar from. They don't have mouths. And the other unfortunate part is that most of their hosts are our deciduous hardwoods, oaks, sweet gums, maple trees are their hosts. So you got to have a nice chunk of hardwood forest. But you know what they say about like planting trees, the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago. The second best time is today or tomorrow, right? So why not get some seedlings started if you want to attract some of the wild silk moths? and many, many, many more. There's hundreds of species, thousands of species of moths in the US. So for almost any plant, there's a moth caterpillar that eats it. So again, I did provide Amy with some resources for you guys, a plant list, some websites of native plant, native plant resources, dark sky to look into that more. So don't worry about like scribbling down every plant name. So now you're getting into it, right? You're like, oh, now I want to actually go mothing and I want to participate in National Moth Week. So great, let's talk about how you can actually participate in the mothing, doing mothing, the verb. So we know moths are attracted to lights. And so if you really want to see them come to you instead of going out and hunting for them in fields of flowers, you can attract them with light. So it can be nothing fancy, right? You don't have to have a fancy setup. If you're just getting into it, why not start by flicking on your porch light for a couple hours, turn it off before you go to bed so you don't light pollute. And you can just sit there by the side of your house and see what moths come in. If you're getting more into it, you can invest in a UV black light or a full spectrum mercury vapor bulb. And if you'd like to look at some supply lists and how-to videos, we have those at our website at nationalmothweek.org. And again, the resources I provided for Amy for this program will also detail that as well. So you need a light source to attract them. And again, you don't have to have anything fancy. You can just use whatever the bulb is in your porch light. You can do a variety of things. They do need a little place to hang on when they get there. So again, you can start out by just looking at the side of your house. And then if you get more into it, you can invest in some more equipment. So you can purchase a self-supported sheet. I had one of these during my dissertation. It's sort of like on those tension tent poles and you stick them in the ground. If you're going to a really remote area, you can have your mobile mothing set up with your light that you can run off your car battery. And this is just an old bed sheet. That's what I favor these days for my mothing programs. Or just if you're lucky enough to have a little back porch, you can just hang a sheet on a rope there. And always, of course, remember at the end, when I give a moth program in person where we do the lighting, we always let them go at the end. Don't just leave them hanging out on the sheet or on the side of your house, because that does open them up again to predation. So sort of shake them out or shoo them away back into the plants where they belong at the end of your observation time. Another way that you can attract moths, turns out that moths actually like beer. Who knew? Who doesn't, right? So you can make a bait. You can take some beer, any kind you want. They're not picky. I like to get one that I like so I can share it with them. And you can put it in a container with any old fruit. Here we could see some bananas and peaches, but really could do whatever you've got hanging around. Put it on your counter, leave it on your countertop for a few days. I cannot emphasize enough, put a cover on that unless you love fruit flies, and let it ferment. And then you can paint it on tree trunks, and you'll attract a slightly different set of species than will come to lights. So it's interesting to do both. And then I just love doing this to a good use for your suet cage. If you don't feed suet in the summer and you only feed suet in the winter to your birds, which many of us do, why let the suet cage sit idle? You can put some any fruit in here, and butterflies and moths will also be attracted to that. I love doing that and seeing butterflies on my suet cage or moths on my suet cage at night. So baiting them as well as using light works. And then more recently, scientists have discovered that caterpillars can actually fluoresce or glow in UV light. So you can purchase a UV flashlight from anywhere online. You can get a UV flashlight and you can crawl around in your butterfly garden and you'll find lots of glowing fluorescing caterpillars, as well as a variety of different insects whose like eye shine will be evident. So it can be really fun to go and look in vegetation for fluorescing caterpillars. So you can use light trapping, you can use bait, and you can use UV light to find them. So then you have to identify what you found. And, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. identifying insects can be really challenging. And moths are no exception. And so here are 3 field guides that I own and like. These, I'm not sponsored, although if Peterson wants to sponsor me, I'm open to it. These are just 3 field guides that I happen to know and like. The Peterson Field Guide to Moths of Northeastern North America is probably our best moth field guide for this area. Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America and Alan Brock and Glassberg's Field Guide to Caterpillars are also great guides to get your hands on. And then you're like, it's 2023, it's the modern day. I don't want to use a book, right? Of course, neither do I, right? So we can use the internet or some smartphone apps to aid in insect ID. So good old bugguide.net has been on the internet for ages, since like the dawn of the internet. It's still going. That can help you with ID. You can even upload photos. Butterfliesandmoths.org, another good ID resource that's been around forever. And then iNaturalist. If many of you probably already use iNaturalist, if you don't, it is a free app for your phone where you take a photo of whatever you see, a plant, an insect, a bird, whatever it is, and it will aid you in identification. It will match your photo to an algorithm and make suggestions, and then actual people will verify that ID. So if you're not using iNaturalist, it is so fun. Again, I am not sponsored. If iNaturalist wants to sponsor me, I'm open to it. But if you have a smartphone, iNaturalist is a really, really fun app to use for biodiversity ID and just making sort of like a virtual collection of yourself for the biodiversity that you find. So let's talk about National Moth Week for a few minutes. So if you go to our website, the first thing you'll see is a countdown. And this is, I took this screenshot just a few hours ago. So Moth Week 2023, as I mentioned, is starting in just under 2 days, so July 22nd. So if you're interested in participating in a Moth Week event, there's a couple of options. So on our website, nationalmothweek.org, we have resources for finding moths. You can contact us, but I will point you to our events map. So if you go to our website and you click on our events map, you can find local public events near you. So if you're interested in attending an event, you can find one there. And if you're interested in hosting, you can also register an event here as well. And it doesn't have to be a big deal. Like you don't have to be a nature center to host a moth night. You could just have yourself in your backyard sharing a beer or a lemonade or whatever with the moths, and that can be a Moth Week event. And then we are a community science project. So if you would like to participate, we have all of our data collected through that app, iNaturalist. And we have it set so you don't actually have to do much of anything. Any Lepidoptera, any moth observation that you put in iNaturalist from the week of July 23rd or 22nd to 30th will automatically be pulled into our data project. And so we collect lots of data that way. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is upload some observations. So this was our page from 2022. Our 2023 one is going to go live in a few days, but you can just see how many people participate. We have over 25,000 people that participated in 2022, and we had 187,000 moth observations. So we're collecting lots and lots of data. And now that we're in, this is our 11th year, we have quite a bit of data that we can start to look at some of our scientific questions, which we want to look at a variety of questions, including whether moth populations are, whether we can detect declines in moth populations over the years, whether we can see shifts in the times that moths are active, throughout the year in response to warmer or colder weather and climate change. So those are just some of our questions that we are starting to look into with our data set that we're gathering every year via iNaturalist. And so you can be a part of that. That's the whole crux of community science. You can be a part of joining this data collection and participate in this science research that we're doing. So like I said, you don't have to do anything. If you observe a moth in iNaturalist, if you upload a photo, it is automatically pulled into our project during the week, and our 2023 page will go live in just a few days. And so I would hope to invite you, I would hope that you guys would love to participate, and I would love to see you guys uploading some data there. So I want to leave you with a quote from this book that I have right here that I've read several times. And if you're going to read one book about conservation, this one's called Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy. And it's a really great resource on how you can, it's called A New Approach to Conservation That Starts in Your Yard, how you can start to take your own land and make it a place for a haven for biodiversity. So I'll leave you with this quote from this book that I find especially powerful. Humans would last only a few months if insects were to disappear from Earth. It's remarkable then that our cultural relationship with insects is not one of awe and appreciation, but one of disgust and animosity. We've created a culture in which insects and their arthropod relatives are maligned. In the name of protecting crops and fighting a few disease vectors, we've declared war on all insects and we kill them whenever we can. We are winning our war against insects at our own peril. So with that, I would like to invite you all to come on over to the dark side, which is what we call watching moths. And I will happily take any questions. And if you, here's our website. And if you think of something later or you want to get in touch with me, please feel free to reach out at my email. So thank you guys for coming tonight and for seeing my program.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was awesome. You can definitely sense your passion for moths. So thank you for being with us and kicking off National Moth Week. Yeah. I hope it goes well. So we do have some questions that have come in, and I will ask them to you. Mm-hmm. So the first is, do specific moths have specific host plants for their caterpillars?
Yeah, so there's a wide range of that. So some across all Lepidoptera, right? Some species are going to be super hyper specialists, and some of them are going to be generalists. So the way that, monarch butterflies can only eat milkweed, there are some moths. The first one that comes to mind is one of those clearwing moths, the snowberry clearwing. Its host plant is snowberry, the shrub. But others of them can eat a wide variety of plants. So with any insect group, there's always going to be variation. And so basically you have to get into it and you got to look online, and for any given moths, for many of them, it's well documented what they eat. For some of them, it's not, but you can look up resources on that and find out what they eat. But so some of them are super specialists that only eat one or will only eat one plant family, and some of them can eat a wide variety of organisms and of plants. And then in my experience, I've raised Luna moths that, they're supposed to be able to eat sweet gum and maple and a few things. And in my experience, they vastly preferred sweet gum over those other ones. So I would start them on sweet gum, and boy, they developed a taste for that. Like they would not switch to any other plants. Sweet gum was their favorite.
Interesting. I like it. All right. How do moths smell their food? In quotes, smell their food.
Right. So what is smell but chemicals in the air, right? So those floral volatile chemicals, just the way that, you can smell a flower, except instead of using nostrils, their antennae have chemical sensors and receptors on them to sense those chemicals. So they use their antennae really the way that we use our sense of smell.
So going back to moths and light, can you just speak again about why the moths are attracted to light in the first place?
Yeah, and it's complicated because we will never know like the real answer, because you can't talk, they can't speak English, they can't speak our languages. And so that they're attracted to light because they confuse any light source for the moon. So when we have this bright moon in the sky, they can use that to navigate, right? They're not flying at the moon, but when you have a light source that's much closer and brighter, that's mistaken for the moon, right? So they're flying in whatever directional flight they have, and I'm no expert on moth cognition, but the way that they're navigating, they will fly accidentally to that light, right? Instead of a navigational direction, and flying like towards a moonlight, which will get them where they need to go, or whatever or fly towards or away from it, they fly to the light thinking, quote unquote, thinking it's that bright moon. But instead it's much closer, and then they are at the light and they get into this I guess a headspace, or for lack of anything better, like a behavioral thought pattern where they're like trying to navigate past or around that. And I know it's complicated. And again, I'm not a moth cognition expert, but so that confusing light source, right? They're trying to get around it or get past it. And they can't they lack any kind of like metacognition, right? They can't figure out why they're not going in the direction they need to go. And so they just circle and circle and circle. I know it's not the greatest explanation, but that's like sort of the best we have. If you can develop a moth communication system, you can get a Nobel Prize and figure out what they're really doing.
So there's two questions that came in specifically about iNaturalist. So the first one is the iNaturalist project that you showed specifically. What was the name on that, so I can add it to the resources? Was that National Moth Week?
It's National Moth Week. And yeah, and so you can manually like go to projects in iNaturalist and opt to put your stuff into our project, but you don't have to do that, right? So if you upload a photo of a moth in iNaturalist, our project automatically sweeps it in. But it's called National Moth Week in iNaturalist.
Oh, that's great. It's very smart.
Yeah, the people at iNaturalist are genius coders.
So the second question about iNaturalist is, are you also collecting data on moth caterpillars as well as adult moths?
Yep, caterpillars count as well. And yeah, so any life stage, the caterpillar, the pupa, or the adult, it all counts.
Great. This question is about finding a giant leopard moth in their yard on Iris cristata. It was so beautiful. And can you share a little bit more about that specific moth's life cycle?
I don't know. I'm not actually sure what their host plant is. I have seen a fair number of them, mostly on hardwood trees, so I'm not sure if they eat those. But I agree that it's an absolutely beautiful and fascinating species. It's one of my favorite to look at, but I'm sorry, I don't actually know a lot about their life cycle. They'll do an egg to pupa or egg to larva to pupa to adult, just the way that any other moth will do, but I'm actually not sure what their host plants are. Sorry.
No worries. I had a quick question. It was great that you showed the very hungry caterpillar, because I often read that during kids programs. And at the end of that nonfiction book, as you mentioned, Eric Carle says that, it makes a cocoon, but then it comes out as a butterfly. Could you share a little bit about the difference between cocoons and chrysalises?
Yeah, so it's really, that's just really a matter of like semantics. So the pupa itself is what the caterpillar turns into. The cocoon is what it wraps itself in. But many people use cocoon and pupa interchangeably, which is fine with me, a professional moth researcher, that's okay. But technically speaking, the pupa or chrysalis is the organism, and the cocoon is what it surrounds itself with. So when we were looking at the silk moths, that's silk, that's the cocoon.
Okay, great. So comparing butterflies to moths, it's more like chrysalis to pupa and not necessarily chrysalis to cocoon.
So so it's not a difference between butterflies and moths. It's just some of them make that additional layer for
Sure.
themselves, and some of them use a leaf as a cocoon.
Okay. So was Eric Carl wrong? Is that what I've been telling all the 3-year-olds? Am I wrong? Am I wrong in telling the kids that Eric Carl was wrong?
No. And if the goal is to just get them interested, right?
Yes.
And if they get into the finer details, they can do that research.
Yes. Great. Talking about our local moths, what are the largest moths in this area? And if you have an idea of actually how big they are, someone is interested.
Yeah, so the wild silk moths that I can go back to here. So these are going to be our largest ones. In particular, the Cecropia moth that has a wingspan. They can get up to a couple inches. And the Luna moths, you know, they're also a couple inches. But and then this one, I don't actually know if you can see the cursor that I'm moving. Yeah, so this one is the imperial moth. That one's also going to be a couple inch, like maybe a 5-6 inch wingspan.
It's tremendous.
Yeah, they're incredible. They're so special to see. And again, there's no nectar plants you can plant. They don't have mouths. They live only a few days to a week, and they need those deciduous hardwoods for their food, their larval food.
All right. This last question, I think, is the perfect one to go out on. What is your favorite joke about moths? And was it told by Norm Macdonald? That is the question.
Someone has to tell me that joke because I don't know. So I will show you actually a little cartoon that I love about Mothman that I have here just for this purpose. So this is not about moths per se, but about Mothman, about this how it's always a mistake to cut bangs. And so the Mothman is coming to warn her of the disaster of cutting bangs. But if there's a Norm Macdonald joke about moths, I would love to hear that because I will tell it at my next program.
That is wonderful. I love this. All right. So Elena was right that she had sent me a ton of resources. There were tons of things in this presentation as well. I took some extra notes during the presentation, but have a lot already to share. And all of that will be uploaded to our Third Thursday lecture webpage that I will point you all to when I send you out the email with the recording. So thank you again, Elena, for your time and your talents tonight. And thank you everyone for joining in and sticking with us through the Q&A. It's always my favorite part. Next month's lecture is Cultivating Soil Health. And that is part of our Arboretum partnership with the Tredyffrin Library. And that will be Thursday, August 17th at 7 p.m. So hopefully you guys can join us for that. But Elena, thank you again for being with us and good luck with National Moth Week.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Good night, everybody.